So I'm Rob Doubleday. I am the Executive Director of the Centre for Science and Policy, and it's my pleasure to be chairing this evening's discussion about food security, the sustainable and healthy supply of food, and the role of international law in helping that happen. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and welcome you all to the discussion. To begin with, I'll give a few housekeeping rules. The audience members, your microphones and cameras will remain off throughout, but do note that the conversation is being recorded, so you can return to it and share it later. We are trying to have as much conversation as we can, so please use the Q&A function throughout the event to put your questions to the panel. Don't wait to the end to put your questions, and then your questions might inspire others. And just to say that we're very grateful to the Cambridge Global Food Security Initiative, which is an interdisciplinary program across the University of Cambridge that brings all kinds of disciplines together to tackle the challenge of supplying plentiful, safe, nutritious, and sustainable food for all. So that's what we're all here for. And the particular topic for today's discussion is the role of international law and how international law can help secure safe and sustainable food, and the tensions perhaps between national concerns, national cultures, national goals, and the international regime, and whether there are tensions or perhaps complementarities between the goals of achieving international free trade and sustainable and safe supplies of food. We're very lucky to have three excellent panelists who are going to each begin to open up these questions. They'll each speak for a short while, and then we will hope to have at least half an hour of discussions with the panel. So in order, we'll hear from Tony Heron, who's a professor of international political economy at York. Then we'll hear from Jellie Molino, who's a postdoctoral researcher in private law at Hughes Hall in Cambridge, and also a senior associate for the Centre for Climate Engagement. And Joyce Brandão, who is a PhD student in geography and also an associate of the Cambridge Conservation Research Institute. And Joyce's research looks at supply chains and the policy of zero deforestation in Brazil. So with that brief introduction, and again, a warm welcome to all of you for joining, I'm going to hand over to Tony.
Thank you, Rob. Hi, everyone. Good evening. And thanks to Rob for the kind introduction, and thank you to Cambridge for the invite to talk to you. I'm just going to share my screen as I've got a few slides. How do I do this? Okay. Just find my presentation. Give me 2 minutes. Here we go. Okay, so so I've been given a few short minutes to introduce the topic and speak to this question: breaking the supply chain, can the law make our food more sustainable? So what I'm going to say initially is to just make a few kind of open and fairly general observations about some of those tensions and potential complementarities that Rob mentioned, and hopefully in the discussion we can maybe probe a little bit deeper into some of the underlying issues. The first thing I suppose to say is that over the last 3 or 4 decades, the salience of food as an issue and the issues around consumer welfare has grown significantly. We can think back, those of you who are old enough to remember mad cow disease, BSE in the 1990s. More recently, we've had the horse meat scandal, and much more recently, growing concerns around deforestation, biodiversity loss, and climate change, all of which are come together in food and agriculture. And agriculture, of course, is one of the biggest drivers of climate change and deforestation. And the food system, in a sense, is defined by something of a paradox. So over time, it's probably true to say that the legal kind of I suppose the regulation and the legal framework underpinning the food system is more robust than it's ever been. And the food that we consume is generally, safer than it's ever been. But our anxiety around food and our awareness of some of the, some of the dark sides of the food system has grown, has grown significantly in that time. And obviously the sheer range and availability of food particularly within wealthy countries has grown significantly. But also we can think about, the growth in, eating disorders, the expose of some of the appalling conditions which food is produced. And these anxieties are connected to the twin processes of the internationalization of our food supply chain, and in terms of the industrialization process by which food is made. So I think that's a sort of a useful context for thinking about the food system as a whole. And so this twin process of internationalization and industrialization prompts three questions which I suppose speak to the growing complexity of our food system. It's a system that is, that is geographically dispersed, so it's spatially complex. It's structurally complex because of the ways in which international supply chains operate. And it's also, of course, politically complex because those structures cut across national jurisdictions on a kind of truly global scale. But anyway, we think about the food system as a series of interconnected activities and outcomes, whether they're nutritional outcomes, whether they're environmental outcomes, whether they're, economic outcomes. It prompts three kind of questions which speak to the role of the law, the role of regulation in food production. Where does our food come from? How is it produced? The social, economic, environmental conditions in which it's produced, and is it safe? And so a good illustration of this complexity is the soybean, which I think one of our other speakers, Joyce, is going to talk about in more detail. Soy is a really good illustration of some of the some of the complexities, but also the ubiquity of agriculture within our food system. So soybeans is among the most globally traded agricultural commodities and one of the key drivers of deforestation, particularly within the southern cone of Latin America and Brazil in particular. Yet our awareness of it and our role in this consumption is to a large extent passive or unwitting. So, we consume a relatively small amount of soy directly, but the indirect consumption of soy, if you're eating fish or you're eating pork, or you're eating chicken, you are almost certainly eating soy and consuming soy. Yet our knowledge of this and how it impacts upon the places in which it is produced is relatively we're relatively ignorant of these processes. And this is a consequence, obviously, of the internationalization and the industrialization of the food system. Next slide. All right. Okay. And so this then leads to, well, how do we regulate? How do we manage? How do we mitigate the externalities that may come from the scale and complexity with which food is produced? And broadly, we can think about four kind of mechanisms, and maybe we can talk a bit more about these in the discussion. So we can talk about kind of government at the border policies. So that's the things that national governments do to enforce on health and safety. So sometimes the technical jargon for this is sanitary and phytosanitary standards, SPS. And so this is a way in which how we prove that the food is not contaminated, there's no biological pathogens within it. And we've also things like chlorinated chicken and hormone treated beef, the moratorium, the bans that the EU and the UK currently impose on those products. So that's a good illustration of national level policies that impose at the border. Then we can think about international agreements. These could be bilateral, regional, or multilateral trade agreements, which contain specific clauses or understandings around the conditions in which food is produced and traded. We can then think about private voluntary arrangements. These can be private standards that managed and policed by supermarkets. In other words, if you want to produce and sell your agricultural produce to Tesco's or to Waitrose, you have to meet certain environmental standards with regard to pesticide use and so on. Or we could think about things like eco labels, fair trade, and so on. And so these are private voluntary arrangements in which consumers take signals from the market and the information that the market provides. And these have become obviously very popular over recent years. And perhaps more recently, what we're seeing now is this idea of due diligence. So what we see now within a number of countries, including the UK, is the use of the state to hold international companies responsible for the conditions, the environmental conditions, the labor conditions within the supply chain, to ensure that they're not just them directly, but their upstream suppliers are conforming to national regulations in the point of production. And so this is a kind of interesting, as I say, hybrid, because it often, the measures or the standards and norms are derived from voluntary arrangements that come from NGOs, come from the private sector. And so you're seeing this kind of intersection between public and private authority. And the implications for this are still being felt. And, you know, many of these arrangements are quite an early stage of implementation. So you're yet to see what kind of significance this will have. Okay, and so just finally then, just trying to pull all this together in terms of the discussion and maybe setting up some of the other presentations. There are a number of issues and tensions that Rob alluded to in when we're thinking about food safety, where our food comes from, how is it produced, under what kind of environmental and social conditions, and is it safe? There are a number of sort of tensions and trade-offs involved when we think about this. It's not just about the reach of the law and the legitimacy and authority of legal instruments to impose change or to regulate. One of the kind of structural parameters for the food system is this you know, often referred to as commodification, and basically what's happened with the internationalization of the food system, the production of food has moved geographically further and further away from the point of consumption. And so not only is there a physical barrier, but also some say that it's an emotional barrier. So the idea is that actually the price signal, conceals the environmental, social conditions maybe of exploitation, which take place at the point of production, yet because they occur, behind the veil of the commodity or the price, we become ignorant and indifferent to those conditions. And some argue that's what allows us to sleep at night with sourcing food from in often quite problematic circumstances. So that's a kind of structural process that's sort of arguably sort of baked into capitalism. Then we have kind of international legal constraints. Now, one of the issues here is that actually, if you want to use the law to enforce higher standards, you have to do so in accordance with multilateral legal obligations, and most typically that you cannot discriminate on the basis of how a good is produced. You have to treat so-called like products the same. Now, there are some exceptions to this and ways around it, but it has proven to be incredibly difficult for states to manage this, even with things like, increasing the amount of information on labeling. If that can be seen as discriminatory, you can fall foul to WTO rules. And, the ubiquitous chlorinated chicken moratorium ban, I mean, that's contested, and it remains a moot point within within international legal circles. So you've got issues there. Then you've got thirdly, you've got issues about voluntary arrangements. Now, the advantage of these arrangements is they don't fall foul of international legal constraints because they're market conforming. They don't discriminate. They're based on consumer preferences. But the evidence shows that scaling up these things is very difficult. Often they are characterized by duplication and overlap, low take up, issues of price sensitivity for consumers. So generally, what we see with eco labels is there's a ceiling on how much, how large that market can grow, and issues of enforcement and whether the claims that appear on the label are credible. So there's all sorts of problems with scale within that. And then finally, you have the fact that the structural complexity, which I started with, makes it actually quite difficult, even if you had the political will and you had the legal authority to impose conditions within the point of production, environmental or social or employment standards or labor standards. Actually, often where the food is produced is in geographically very remote places, very difficult to know how we trace that food, how we attribute those activities to particular suppliers. Even with the advent of technology and data surveillance, it's still it's a very, very difficult process. So there are sort of technical obstacles to that kind of move, even though that's been, that's one of the kind of arguments and I suppose one of the shifts that we're seeing now with the use of technology. And so all of this informs our discussion and what's possible and what is practical, what is legal, and what is economically acceptable. Because ultimately, of course, we also, at least certain stakeholders would say, essentially it's a trade-off between, if you like, one set of consumer rights around affordability and price, and another set of consumer rights around, around food safety, around, attributes of food, and as well as, if you like, certain other kind of norm-backed claims around environmental standards or labor standards with which the food is produced. So you can see that, the question about the law isn't just a simple question about the enforcement of law. There are all sorts of structural and political and moral kind of pitfalls in the way of that discussion. So hopefully those comments can open up the discussion. So I'll hand back to Rob now, and thank you for that.
Great, thank you, Tony. It's very clear, very helpful setting out of the scene. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of questions that people might want to ask. So I do encourage you to please pop your questions, if you can, in the Q&A, such as, where are there examples where different kinds of laws, as Tony said, are actually making a difference, disputes, maybe probe Tony on some practical examples. I don't know, put whatever questions you like. But with that, I'd like to turn over to Jellie.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Tony, for setting the scene for our discussion. So I will try to give specific examples on what Rod had discussed. But before that, allow me first to thank the organizer for the invitation, and for purpose of our participants who may not be familiar with the organizations that I'm currently connected. So I would like to introduce, of course, the college, the Hughes College, which we see on the upper portion of the slides. That is the college where I belong. And then, of course, the bottom is the Center for Climate Change Engagement. I think the slides will be shared, so you can actually click on the link to learn more about our college and the center. But for purposes of this discussion, what I will be sharing with you are experiences that I have in the past years in my capacity working for promoting sustainable aquaculture in my country, in the Philippines. And of course, in some of the works that I've been doing with international organizations such as UNEP, UNDP, and right now with the World Bank on how are we going to control sustainable public procurement, at least, as our way of ensuring that the global supply chain will be more or less sustainable, specifically if it is the government which is buying. So basically, this is what I will be sharing with you are some highlights on how the governments are actually trying to promote sustainability in the global supply chain using their purchasing power. But at any rate, whatever it is that I will be sharing, though, based on personal projects, are my own assessment and is not binding to the organizations that I am being connected or have been connected in the past. So on my first intervention, actually, I would like to focus on, can regulations really stop the trade of foods that produced using environmentally damaging methods? And I would like to share a specific case that I handled more than 10 years ago. This is a case of responsibly farmed aquaculture in the lake. But before it became actually sustainable, more than 10 years ago, specifically in 2011, there were a series of fish kills in Taal Lake. But to give you a perspective, in my country, Taal Lake is actually popular not because of aquaculture, but because in the middle of the lake, there is a volcano called Taal Volcano, which is I think known worldwide as the smallest volcano in the world. So if you will look at Google it, you'll see that within that lake, there is a volcano. And in fact, our government has declared it as a protected area. But before the declaration of the government of it being a protected area, aquaculture or fish cage operation has been existing as a source of livelihood of the communities. But because it was not fully regulated, of course, what is the effect? It actually resulted to damaging the quality of the water in the lake, which resulted to numerous fish kills. So this is just an example of some of these fish kills that happened and reported in media in 2011, which actually call for the filing of a writ of kalikasan. So what is a writ of kalikasan? Actually, in 2010, the Philippines became one of the first countries that had actually promulgated a special rules and regulations for environmental protection. So the writ of kalikasan is a Filipino word for nature, so it is also known as a writ of nature. In this case, if we, in my country, see that there are public officials and even private sectors that are violating our right to a healthy ecology, which is a protected right in the Constitution, we can actually file a case before the Supreme Court for the Supreme Court to actually call the government agency or the private sector that is violating such right because they are actually destroying the environment to stop that activity and ask them to actually do some remedial measures to prevent the damage. So in that case, because of the numerous fish kills that had been happening, Agham party list, actually, it's a party list, part of a Congress, filed a case before the Supreme Court. And in this case, what they were asking is for the Supreme Court to call the Department of Natural Resources to stop, order assist order to remove all the fish cages because it was destroying the lake. So in that case, I was a very young lawyer more than 10 years ago. The local fish cage operators approach me and say, if they are going to remove the fish cage, what would be the alternative livelihood that you will be providing to the community? So it's like there is a need really to balance, the protection of the environment and at the same time providing a livelihood to the community. So in that case, we agreed to organize the local fish cage operators and come up with an NGO called Taal Lake Aquaculture Alliance. And then, of course, representing them, we filed actually an intervention case before the Supreme Court and asked them that, don't remove the fish cage, but support us to make our industry more sustainable and more and make us more responsible. In that case, there are a lot of networkings that had been conducted to support the fish cage industry to change the farming protocols, and a lot of negotiations took place until such time that a memorandum of agreement has been executed between the petitioner and all the affected parties within the lake. And this particular memorandum of agreement was presented to the court, and it was accepted. So the court actually, at that moment, issued a writ of continuing mandamus. It's a special proceeding, again, wherein the court, the Supreme Court, through the Court of Appeals, has jurisdiction over the lake to make sure that all of those mechanisms that were integrated into this agreement, to make sure that there is a more responsible management of the lake where all of these industries could coexist without actually destroying the environment, would be implemented. In fact, some of this mechanism is first making sure that there is actually an institution that will monitor all the activities in the lake, because prior to this case, yes, this is protected area, but there's only one man monitoring everything without staff, without budget. But because of the case, the government has no choice, because there was an order of the court to provide staff to actually regulate the lake and all of the activities there, and there is a budget, and then there is actually a unified rules on how to regulate fisheries in the lake, both the fish cage operators and the open fishing. So in that case, and all NGOs were obliged to comply and come up with their own code of conduct on how to do their economic activities in the lake. And they were even required to participate in the water quality monitoring and coastal cleanup. And there is also a negotiation between different municipalities, because in this particular area, the lake is actually surrounded by different municipalities. And in case there would be dispute, it has to be resolved using multi-party system through, of course, the regulatory agency. So as of this day that we are actually discussing, the court still has jurisdiction because the continuing mandamus has not been lifted, and these parties are still submitting reports to the court on how they are actually implementing all of those measures to make sure that there is sustainable aquaculture on the part of the aquaculture industry, and at the same time, other industries that are operating the lake are also required to make sure that they are participating on how to promote a more environmental management of the lake, while of course promoting economic livelihood. So in this case, I could say that yes, regulations, specifically if those are implemented even through court intervention, could really help us to make sure that our foods are produced with less environmental damages, because this is a very specific case that happened in the Philippines. Now, on the second intervention, actually, the second intervention now that I would like for us to look at is how do national and international law agreements actually protect individual consumer? Because the case that I shared was very specific on a specific province, and it is not even cascaded in the Philippines. Back then, I was actually, as a young lawyer, I was actually promoting for the implementation of third-party certification of aquaculture in my country. But it was so difficult. It was so difficult, to actually use this bottom to top approach to convince the government to adopt this as a matter of policy. So in that case, you become so passionate on how can you help the country to change its policy for you to implement a more sustainable consumption and production mechanism in that country. So actually, I left the Philippines and pursue a graduate study that is really, really very focused on sustainable consumption and production, more particularly when the government is buying. Because I was saying, you are regulating us, the private sector, but the government in itself is not looking on how it is actually buying or even regulating other industries. So in that case, I would like to share with you, because I had an opportunity to work with UNEP in the completion of the recently concluded 2022 Sustainable Public Procurement Global Review. Of course, for those who are not familiar, when we say procurement, it is buying. And we say public procurement, it is the buyer is the government. Some countries call it government acquisition. And then, of course, when we talk about sustainable public procurement, it is incorporating sustainability to the environmental criteria, social criteria, in the way that the government is buying. Either it is buying green products or organic foods, or it is buying from responsible suppliers, or it is buying from suppliers within proximate geography to make sure that there would be less greenhouse gas emission due to the logistic of your supply chain. So in that case, we actually look on the trend insofar as the international agreements that could influence sustainable consumption and production, more particularly when the government is the one buying. So if you look at this figure 3.2, these are the international agreements that are actually supporting sustainable consumption and production, which of course include what? Sustainable and production of food supplies. And in this case, we check also, like, how do these international agreements actually influence the national law? If you look at figure 3.3, after the Rio 20, you'll see an increase of national policy, of national regulations that are actually aligned with the need to make sure that consumption and production are sustainable. And it even increases at the time of the adoption of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. So you see that this is one way of actually, protecting individual consumers. Now, with respect to the very specific issues that we are talking in terms of food, for example, you'll see that we'll check also what are the different products and services that have been prioritized by the government in those national policies that are aligned with international laws and agreement. You'll see here, I highlighted food and catering services, because this particular review is actually the third. UNEP did it in 2013, 2017, and then the recent is 2022. So we did a comparative analysis of 2017 and 2021 or 22. So in food and catering services, for example, you see it was 8 among the priority of the government, it becomes 6. Now, to give you a very specific example on how is it on the ground, let's look at the example of this particular national strategy in the EU, which is known as Farm to Fork strategy. In this case, this was actually launched in 2020. But if you will look on this particular strategy and how would it actually, protect consumers, this particular strategy, if you look, is actually looking on reduction of pesticides. It also looked on making sure that, when you are producing, you are not actually reducing the nutrients in the soil, and even you're actually promoting organic farming. So in this case, through this particular policy that actually it is being implemented in the EU, but this is aligned again from the international agreement that had been implemented and then cascaded to the national national strategy, we are actually protecting individual consumers.
Great.
Now, again, let's put it in a more context.
Jellie, I think that you've done an amazing job in setting out the argument.
Last slide.
Okay, just to make sure Joyce has time to present.
Okay, just last slide. This is the last slide. The last slide is here. So in terms of the framework, this is how it is being done. And just an example in the Brazil, if this is the Brazil, which is inclusive public procurement, you'll see, and just recently, what we are doing insofar as Brazil is concerned, the national policy is there, but now, starting next month, we will be looking at the 27 states of Brazil to make sure that from the international agreement we're in being implemented in Brazil, we're now going to the state level and making sure that they will be also promoting sustainability in their procurement that would affect, of course, the global supply chain. Thank you so much. I'm sorry.
It's very it's fascinating stuff, and thank you very much for that contribution. So now just moving straight on, in the interest of time, to Joyce.
Can you see my screen?
We can see your screen again. Yes, there you go.
Okay.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Is it without notes?
Without notes, that's perfect.
Okay. Okay, so thank you for the introduction, Tony and Jellie. And so just a brief introduction about myself. I'm also Brazilian, so besides my academic career, I have been working with agriculture and environmental policy in Brazil for more than 15 years. And that's how I land here in my PhD. And I am our project, my project is supervised by Professor Rachel Garrett from the Department of Geography. And we are funded by the European Research Council. So I'm skip from the introduction and all this introductory information about the agricultural-driven deforestation that Tony has already told us. And so my idea was to focus on the regulatory, the voluntary environmental commitments that some of the agricultural supply chain has made in the last 20 years. And focus on this zero deforestation commitment that the soy supply chain has signed in 2006, sorry. So when we ask, like, if the agreement has protect us from from consumers on food sustainability, if we zoom in on this policy that the soy supply chain has implemented for the Amazon biome in Brazil. So it means that to tackle the deforestation that has been driven by the soy expansion in the Amazon, the soy sector has committed to not purchase soy on lands that has been deforested after July 2008. So a lot of studies has shown that it has been successful, effective in terms of protecting these soy, to protecting the market from soy that as a direct driver of deforestation. But of course, this reduction in deforestation in the Amazon in the last, since the beginning of the 2000 and the middle of the 2012 is not just like enforcement, it's not just as a result of a policy agreement, but also a combination of public policy enforcement for the law to protect the forest in Brazil. But besides this, besides the success and the effectiveness of this policy, we could see that this commitment has left out other ecosystems that are also important for providing biodiverse and ecosystem service, and that's the case of the Cerrado. I don't know if it's I always, when I'm talking about it, I ask who knows about Cerrado, and it's a very low audience that knows. So Cerrado, it's a Brazilian savanna that is a highly hotspot of biodiversity. And we see that, like here in this graph, that the deforestation, the soy-driven deforestation in the Amazon has dropped and has been, we could say, stable over the years. And it's not the same for the Cerrado. And for like looking for this trends in the soy-driven deforestation, other studies has also, and our group, Rachel has led part of this research, that we have seen that if this kind of strict voluntary commitment had been implemented in the Cerrado biome, 46% of direct soil deforestation could be avoided in this region. And we also have seen that 16 to 4% of deforestation avoided in the Amazon has offset, has leakage for additional soil deforestation in Cerrado. Okay, we have some soil that is not driven or has been reducing a lot the deforestation in the Amazon, but what about the other biomes? So that's what has mobilized me and the group to understand why it has happened. And I have been working in this paper, like, what is the framework for understanding this voluntary environmental policy feasibility, considering this difference across the regions in the same supply chain as soy? And what we could see is that this stringent environmental policy, stringent voluntary environmental policy, as the soy moratorium, is a function of this public opinion that influence the market. So there is a clear forest bias to protect the Amazon and like neglecting the other ecosystems as the Cerrado. There is a critical political contest and government capacity that influence which type of policies are possible. And here we see also the policy will and the regulatory framework, the national regulatory framework that's also biased to protect more the forests instead the other ecosystems. The company power too, because the company power related to their suppliers, to their producers and consumers also influence their market risk to adopt or not adopt a policy. We also have seen that the market structure and the financial cost associated to adopt or not a more stringent policy is also in the table of the discussions, and it also in terms of international and national demands for soy. So we see like the tension between having Europe and China as the main market for Brazil, for example, for soy, and how these trends on European more sustainable demands can be powerful, but with this shift for China's a bigger market has also shifted the company's willingness to take a more stringent policy. And finally, we see that leadership, it's also count a lot when we desire to have a more stringent policy. But of course, that all these factors come together in a policy window. So in this paper specifically, we are demonstrating this, that we had a policy window for the Amazon, and at that time it was not an open window for the Cerrado conservation. But beside that, we see that the national political change has been very, very critical on taking these decisions. So to summarize and try to keep my time, some takeaways from my specific research and how does it actually dialogue with the law and stable food production is that we can have regulations or national, international, at national or international scale or private ones, but the political window, the national political factors can be decisive for the implementation. And some change in the political regimes, that's the case of Brazil, has weakened the enforcement of law in the last years. And it also has affected the enabling conditions for the voluntary environmental commitments. And clearly, like the shift in Brazilian political regime in 2009 to a far right-wing president has constrained the progress of the Cerrado Agreement in the soy supply chain. So what we learn that the design and the adoption of policy and regulations need to prevent and or consider that market deviations can happen. It means that we can have for example, a European Union or UK due diligence for no deforestation products, but it can like just be a deviation for companies decided to sell to China that has less demand on sustainability indicators. Companies want to lower their risk, so it might driven them to opt for market diversion, and worsen, that can really drive them to a smallholder exclusion strategy and exacerbate the inequalities that is already in place in our food systems. And last but not least important is the leakage across ecosystems. So I applied this framework for soy moratorium, but we could see that the UDR and even the UK due diligence, they are still focused on forest formation, not having like a more broader understanding of the conservation of other native vegetation. And finally, yes, what would be interesting is to play a more cooperative role from these regulations, international regulatory, sorry, and to build capacity on national countries and national policy regulations, also to contribute on bringing and building a robust traceability system that would help the entire food system, not having like small solutions that don't put everyone in the same table and having the same measures for everyone. So that is a bit of I would like to bring, and running on time, I hope that we can dialogue now about that. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Joyce. Thank you. I mean, what a great trio of perspectives that set out some of the important questions here. Please do put questions into the chat if you have questions, but I might begin just because, Tony, you set the scene with, you know, the diversity of outcomes we might be wanting to achieve and the different ways that law does and can play a role in helping to achieve those. And then we had some great examples from Jellie and Joyce that just illustrated the complexity that you sort of pointed out. Could you talk, Tony, a little bit about, you know, how realistic is it that we can hope that these kind of legal approaches that we've heard discussed can grapple with the complexity and the tensions, and it may be referring to the two examples we heard?
Okay, yeah, it's a very good question. I think it was, yeah. I think that, I mean, one of the questions we haven't really talked about, which is implicit, I think, in a lot of this is scale. you know, you have, I suppose you can think about it in terms of what national governments can do at the border. And clearly, I think with Jellie's talk, you could see that actually within country, the power of the state to enforce outcomes is, you know, if the political will is there, then that is one. That's a relatively simple part of the puzzle. Now, the extraterritorial reach of states, once it's not at the border, once you're trying to enforce conditions in a third country, then I think that's where it gets really, really complicated. So it's complicated because you are obviously you are potentially interfering with the sovereignty of another country. It's complicated because of the ways in which it is tied up with international legal obligations around non-discrimination. And so if I was to be optimistic, I would say that what you have in a sense with you know, with voluntary arrangements is you have a potential for a more nimble way around some of those legal constraints. But then you have the problem with market failure, yeah, that actually you can't use price signals to actually shape consumer behavior. But I think one interesting area that seems to me that may, you know, and there were some ideas around this within the Dimbleby food report around compulsory methods of production labeling. So that's the idea that actually the kind of eco labels which provide additional information. So every label contains mandatory information on nutrition and product content. And then you have eco labels or other forms of certification which provide additional information. Now, one of the areas I think is quite you know, promising is actually the idea that states could legislate for further information within, you know, within how food is produced, for instance. And so there's a legal, you know, it's backed by kind of hard, if you like, hard law, but also it is driven towards not preventing companies from doing certain things or countries from doing certain things, but actually empowering consumers with a greater variety of information. Now, clearly, you've still got problems there, but I think that's kind of the direction we're heading, I think, if one was to be optimistic. And certainly some of the, you know, some of the issues that Joyce was talking about, we're seeing that now, I think, in terms of trying to use sort of, you know, rather than, I think there was a time where voluntary arrangements were seen as, you know, that was the way, and particularly the word, you think about how the environmental movement reconfigured itself around the private sector, because it was seen as that was a more responsive way to deal with it. So I think you're seeing glimpses that maybe there is space for a bit more hybridity, and certainly I think, like, you know, methods of production labeling is one area, but it's again it is complicated and it's not straightforward. But that'd be one area I may point to, I would say.
Great. I mean, Joyce, I might ask you to come in, you know, to pick up on Tony's point with reference to your work. And perhaps, I don't know if you can see in the chat, there's a question that's directed at you, which I think is perhaps related. So do you want to sort of respond to Tony and pick up the question in the chat, which is about the influence of private standards in upgrading or downgrading the Brazilian supply chain?
Yeah, so just a comment, Tony, like in terms of scale, because one of your discussion point was like maybe the challenge of scaling up private voluntary commitments. What is seen the case of Brazil specific, because in parallel of all these studies that we have seen about the effectiveness of soy moratorium and what could be avoided to Cerrado deforestation, we also see that there is land available to expand soy without any deforestation. There is a land rationale behind that could be easily responded. But so in terms of scaling up, in terms of, because soy, if we scale up and apply the soy commitment for the entire soy supply chain, would be a huge goal. So in terms of, there is a rationale that could be scaled up because we have land to expand the production and with no deforestation, but there is very regional and political and lobby against that. So it's really this tension also about like science in terms of what we can provide in terms of evidence and what is really in place and being discussed and negotiated. So and how does this like the UDR is gonna lead to that? Like there is this condition of revising it for the next years about including or not other ecosystem that is not forest. So we need to see how it's going to be. And for this, I take the hook to answer the question about how do I see the influence on private standards. In terms of soy specifically, I don't see the soy moratorium downgrading because it's very well established and there is results on that. They have they were able to maintain the agreement even with a far-right president that were wondering to like finish with all this environmental policy. So I don't see that it would be downgrading. However, we don't see movements like to having a sector-wide commitment for the Cerrado. Yeah. There is this like expectation that the UDR, the UK division, the other policy could like amplify this this commitment, but in terms of the sector-wide commitment, we don't see it upgrading beyond the Amazon.
Interesting. Oh, we just have 2 minutes left, I'm afraid, Jellie. So I'd just like to turn to Jellie and maybe to pick up some of these questions about the kind of hybrid approach and labeling and voluntary approaches and how that intersects with private law, which is the area you look at in particular. I mean, do you see private law playing a role here in regularizing these governance regimes?
Actually, yes, we were very optimistic about it. Although, of course, as mentioned, much of the work that I've been doing for the past years is really focusing on how the government will be the champion in voluntary commitment to make sure that the labeling will be done through government purchasing. But at any rate, realize that after years of work, that if you don't focus also on the private law, the problem is now the government has expanding its regulations to make sure that it is buying for its own project and needs certified products, certified services, but there is none in the market. There is not in the market. So if you look at, like, for example, in the case of the US, just recently, this is a private law, investment law, which is what they are saying, okay, we will provide incentives to private sectors that will produce environmental friendly products, climate friendly products. So in that case, it's like actually incentivizing them to produce more products that are certified environmentally friendly, because at the end of the day, when you don't provide private incentive to regulations, the government has nothing to buy. Yeah. The people has nothing to buy. The public in general has nothing to buy. So I think that's how we are seeing how the regulations is actually working and hybrid.
Great. Well, on behalf of global food security, and firstly to thank all the people that joined the discussion, and then for them to thank our three panelists. You really set out the importance of this question of the intersection of law and our supply chains and the sustainable, safe and nutritious supply of food. I have to say, you've convinced me that it's very complicated, and so we clearly need the kind of interdisciplinary scholarship that you three are providing, and very engaged with, you know, actual supply chains on the ground. And it seems that these kind of questions are only going to grow in importance, and therefore that interdisciplinary kind of systems level scholarship is going to be really vital. So we're grateful to you three for joining the conversation, for setting out some of the really inspiring work that you're doing, and we hope this is the beginning of a conversation that will continue. So with that, and thanks to the organizers once again, Abigail and Francesca, and thanks to you all for joining, I'll say goodbye. Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone. Good evening. Bye.